What can we learn by reflecting on the ancient warrior culture and warfare in ancient Greece, Rome, and Israel? Why was the Greek army and navy superior to those of her neighbors? Why were the Spartan and Athenian hoplite infantry forces and Athenian triremes able to defeat the mighty Persian forces? Did the Roman army become more proficient and professional under the Roman emperors? And why was the Roman army such an effective fighting force? How does the Old Testament depict the warrior cultures of ancient Israel and Judah? Did the armies of Joshua really massacre the wicked pagans in the Promised Land? Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources used for this video. Please feel free to follow along in the PowerPoint script we uploaded to SlideShare. The brutality of living in a warrior culture was subdued when an empire conquered surrounding city-states and held them. Those who were not enslaved but were left behind often lived a quasi-independent existence, paying tribute to the far-off king. After several generations, they lost their martial spirit, as they no longer feared they would be conquered and enslaved, as they were under the protection of the empire. This happened when the Greek colonies on the western coast of Ionia, or Turkey today, were conquered by the Persians. The Greek historian Thucydides tells us that the mainland Greeks were not able to train the trireme crews of the Ionian Greeks as they lacked military discipline and martial spirit. Likewise, after the Macedonians conquered the Greek mainland under Alexander the Great, the Greeks were not able to overcome the invading Romans several generations later. Likewise, after the Romans conquered Judah and Israel, by the time of Jesus, many Jews had lost the military spirit of the Maccabeans. This could explain why Jesus in the New Testament exhorts us to love our enemies and turn the other cheek, while the Old Testament, written when the Jews were in a warrior culture, only exhorted the Jews to love their fellow Jews. Why love other nations who might slaughter your men and enslave your women and children? Indeed, in his book on Hillel, Rabbi Teleshkin comments that Jews are not fond of turning the other cheek because they believe in justice for the oppressed. In our first video, we discussed how most ancient cultures, and in particular the cultures of ancient Greece, Rome, and Israel, were warrior cultures out of necessity, as warfare was a fact of life. We reflected on what Homer's Iliad and Odyssey reveals about this warrior culture, and how this underpinned ancient attitudes towards concubines and slaves. In the ancient world, slaves were either born into slavery or were captured during wars or by pirates. Slaves were the employees of the ancient world, and sexual abuse of women was a problem under all systems of slavery, and is still a problem today, especially when women hold low-paying or entry-level positions. What were some of the Greek innovations in warfare? One Greek innovation to ancient warfare was their hoplite warrior phalanx, a formation of 8 to 10 rows of 100 or more warriors, sometimes extending a quarter of a mile. The shields of the front row would interlock, and the entire formation would press upon the enemies. The soldiers would first throw their spears, then jab with their swords from behind their shields, strictly maintaining their position. This required training and practice. The Athenians expected their nobles to drill during the year, while the Spartans had a year-round military that practiced year-round, living in barracks. These Greek hoplite phalanxes were terrifying to encounter on the battlefield. In the First Persian War and the Battle of Marathon, the Athenian phalanxes approached the Persian forces at a run, shouting war whoops, and the Persian mercenaries were not quite used to this elan. They panicked and were slaughtered as they ran. In the Second Persian War, the 300 Spartan hoplites held off the entire Persian army in the famous battle at the Pass of Thermopylae. Before the battle for the Pass of Thermopylae, the Spartans were seen brushing their long braids. The Persian king asked his Greek military advisor why they would do this, and he responded, "That is always what Spartans do before they know they will face death in battle." Spartan women would admonish their sons to either return as heroes or dead on their shields. Herodotus relates that when a Spartan was told that the Persian army was so numerous that when they fired their arrows, they would blot out the sun, the Spartans responded that this was good. It meant that they could fight in the shade. Often hoplite armies parried in a standoff with no winners. Often battles lasted only an hour. Some sources estimate that typically there was a 5% casualty rate for winners, and 3 times these casualties for the losing side. though other sources suggest that in particularly brutal battles, the losing side could suffer horrendous casualties if they broke and ran and were slaughtered by the opposing army. The well-off noble citizens of ancient Greeks were expected to purchase their hoplite equipment. This included a round leather shield covered in bronze, a bronze helmet and breastplate, greaves or shin armor, an 8-foot-long thrusting spear, and a short sword. Most Greek cities only had the infantry hoplites. They had no cavalry forces because horses were not that effective when fighting in mountainous Greece. Later, King Philip and his son Alexander the Great of Macedon would improve upon the Greek military formations by equipping his hoplite soldiers with 15-foot-long spears and adding cavalry units of archers and swordsmen, or other units that took advantage of military skills of his non-Greek subjects. Were the Spartans the best hoplite infantry soldiers in the Greek world? Although the Spartans were full-time soldiers, Athens could field a hoplite army equal in both skill and bravery to any Spartan hoplite army, and it was the Athenian hoplites who defeated the Persian army in the Battle of Marathon. Before the Peloponnesian Wars, the Athenian hoplites had bested Spartan hoplites in battle. The Athenian Empire was an ancient Mediterranean version of the British Empire. Athens was a naval power with extensive trading network from Egypt to the shores of the Black Sea, and they had a large fleet of several hundred triremes that defeated the Persian Navy. These triremes had 3 files of rowers, about 170 in total, carrying a small contingent of archers and hoplites. Triremes were fast ships that had a bronze battering ram below the waterline at the front of the ship that was used to sink the opposing ship. Triremes were like huge rowboats. They had to beach overnight or at mealtime. Rarely did they attempt to cross the Mediterranean. The rowers were citizens who usually were not property owners. They were a full-time professional navy paid by the state. It took a great deal of skill and stamina to row these triremes, and the crews drilled year-round. These sailors were participants in the radical democracy of Athens, and then as now, veterans demanded that their voices be heard by the government. We also reflect on Greek warfare by land and sea in our review of the histories of Herodotus. And what were the Roman innovations in warfare? Like Alexander the Great, the Romans fielded professional armies that could fight for years at a time in distant theaters of war. Alexander's Greek army and later Roman armies intermarried with the locals and recruited foreign soldiers. Under the Roman Emperor Octavian, the army started to recruit volunteers into the army as professional soldiers who would enlist for many years. By the end of the 1st century, volunteers outnumbered conscripts in the Roman army. Probably 1 in 5 of Roman citizens were conscripts in the army. Non-citizens could enlist as auxiliaries who were promised citizenship at the end of their service, adding cultural diversity to the army. When soldiers were injured or had served for 25 years, they retired on farms in the provinces, sometimes receiving a stipend, which helped to integrate the empire. The historian Garland tells us the conditions of service in the Roman army were sometimes appalling. According to Tacitus, some men served for 30 to 40 years, their bodies maimed by wounds. When they were finally discharged, they might be given a waterlogged marsh or unplowed hillside to farm. One of the fatal weaknesses of the old Roman Republic is the army, rather than the state, recruited the soldiers. Starting with Julius Caesar and the early Roman emperors, the Roman armies were more loyal to their generals than to Rome, which meant that the empire would often be embroiled in civil wars when competing generals fought to be emperor. The system was reformed during the reign of Emperor Diocletian, who established a bureaucracy to administer both the military and empire, dividing the empire into a more easily administered western and eastern divisions. The training of Roman armies is similar to modern armies. New soldiers had to go through a 4-month boot camp located near the Tiber River. They were taught how to use a sword, spear, bow and arrow, darts and slings, and how to swim, build a camp, and practice formations. They fought in formations somewhat like the hoplites, but more mobile, more like the army of Alexander. The Roman army was organized into legions. They would charge when they were about 30 yards from their enemy, hurling their spears. Like the Greeks, they had a shield, helmet, and breastplate, spear, dagger, and sword, all weighing over 60 pounds. In addition, they marched with the tools needed to build a camp, with pickaxe, saw, spade, and basket for moving earth. When they weren't fighting, they built and maintained the road system of the Roman Empire and other infrastructure like bridges. Under the Roman emperors, like the United States Armed Forces, the army became more proficient and professional. The biographer Marcus Aurelius stated that no other nation in the ancient world matched the Roman army in discipline, technique, and efficiency. The Roman army was superbly trained, and its arms and equipment were superior to those of its enemies. Her commanders had perfected the use of cavalry as shock troops, and the skill of her engineers was legendary. Whether the task was to build a bridge over the Danube or break apart an impregnable fortress like Masada, they could always find a way. In Marcus Aurelius' time, only men of senatorial rank could command a legion. Members of the equestrian order were restricted to commanding the brigades of auxiliaries. Legions posted in the provinces worked closely with the governors. Although disaster could strike when a less competent commander misdirected the forces under his command, when left alone the Roman legions could rarely be beaten. For example, when the co-emperor with Marcus Aurelius, Lucius Verus, was titular head of the legions battling the Persians in Parthia, he spent his time hunting and carousing, leaving his capable commanders to run the successful war. As time passed, the provinces became more Romanized, and more of the so-called barbarian warriors were inducted into the Roman army. After the Parthians were subdued under Marcus Aurelius, the Greek tribes surreptitiously formed a coalition to challenge Roman Empire in Germania and the Alps. There were fears the Germanic tribes would invade Italy as the Carthaginian general Hannibal and his elephants had done centuries before. The German forces were more effective because they adopted some Roman military practices, though they were still no match for the long-term strategy and military discipline seen under the leadership of Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Also, their barbarian warrior ethos dictated that they would attack in mass against the strongest point of the Roman line, which, though more courageous, was often a problematic tactic. The Romans fought a war of attrition, patiently dividing and conquering the Germanic tribes one by one. Though they slaughtered the men from some tribes, other tribal warriors were hired as mercenaries to fight in other theaters of war and were effective fighting forces for Rome. And what was warfare like in the Old Testament times? Warfare is mentioned over 300 times in the Old Testament, swords 400 times. Ancient Israel was caught in many of the ancient wars since it was in the crossroads of trade routes between Mesopotamia and Egypt. Since Judah was mountainous, its armies relied heavily on infantry. But the Bible does mention that King Ahab of the northern kingdom had chariots, and that he was felled by an arrow probably shot by a composite bow. Assyria and Babylon had cavalry archers on horseback, but not Egypt or Israel. An Israeli chariot had 3 horses pulling 3 men, a driver with a spear, an archer, and a shield bearer. And we know from our Sunday school stories that King David slew Goliath with a sling, but the ancient slings were not the puny toys we imagine. The sling in the ancient world was a deadly combat weapon. A skilled slinger could sling a rock over 120 miles an hour, faster than the fastest fastball. Jerusalem and most ancient cities had walls and fortified towers with a guarded rampart manned by soldiers, ready to rain rocks and arrows and boiling oil on the attackers stuck in the moat. Placing cities under siege was a big part of ancient warfare. These sieges could last 6 months or more, sometimes a year or 2. Pets did not last long in an ancient city under siege. The attackers would try digging under the moat and the walls. The defenders would dig counter tunnels with smoke, bees, and soldiers fighting in the dark tunnels. Assyrians and Romans would sometimes build siege ramps behind movable towers manned by archers to breach the ramparts above. Or sometimes they would use battering rams to smash through the walls or gates. We read in Samuel how King David was tempted by Bathsheba bathing on a roof one spring day, when he had his general Joab march out with the army in the spring. Because, as the Old Testament says, spring is when the kings march out to war. In the ancient world, in both Greece and Israel, wars were often fought in the spring after the rains had ceased and the crops had been harvested. Spring was when the Ottomans invaded the Balkans, fighting all the way to the walls of Vienna, deep into the Middle Ages. The Assyrians were particularly cruel warriors. Probably the 10 tribes that the Assyrians defeated were lost to history because in many cities the Assyrians followed the ancient common practice of slaughtering the men of the defeated army and enslaving their women and children, totally obliterating all traces of their society. And the book Life and Biblical History has an interesting comparison of the biblical and Assyrian accounts of the siege of Jerusalem by Sennacherib. Although the Psalms mention the cruelty of the forced march of the exiled Jews to Babylon, once they reached their destination, the Babylonians allowed the Jews to settle their men, women, and children in separate communities, and allowed them to worship Yahweh in the traditions of their fathers. Although we cannot say for sure that no Jews were enslaved, we get the impression in Ezekiel that the Jewish community was left relatively undisturbed. They were able to reach a level of prosperity that enabled them to sponsor synagogues and rabbis that wrote down the moral laws and traditions in the ancient stories of their forefathers. When Cyrus the Great conquered Babylonia, he allowed those Jews who wished to return to their homeland, but many Jews chose to stay behind in Babylonia. Whereas before, Jews were the descendants of those who had fled Pharaoh to the Promised Land, now the Jews were understood to be those who lived by the commands of the Torah, now both written and oral. The book Life in Biblical Israel devotes many interesting pages on how Jerusalem and other fortunate ancient cities were able to dig down behind the walls until they hit the water table or an aquifer to ensure a pure water supply during a siege, which could last 6 months or more. Jerusalem was fortunate to have the spring of Gihon under the city. In the wet season there was plenty of water, and even in the dry season the spring's cave could fill 3 times a day. And the spring of Gihon fed the pool of Siloam. Did the massacres of Joshua recorded in the Old Testament really happen? We puzzle how a loving God can instruct the Jews to massacre the pagans of Palestine in the book of Joshua. And the answer to this puzzle is the God of Joshua is an ancient God who leads his chosen people into battle against the despicable foe. The God of Joshua is the God who Miriam worships in her song, when she sings of the God who throws horse and rider into the sea after the Jews cross over the parted Red Sea. In the Song of the Sea sings of our warrior God. I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my might, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him. My father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. This is from Exodus. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he cast into the sea. His picked officers were sunk in the Red Sea. The floods covered them. They went down into the depths like a stone. St. Augustine, in his work on Christian Doctrine, teaches us that when reading the Old Testament stories, we should interpret allegorically those stories that do not appear to describe a properly moral lesson, and do not appear to support the twofold love of God and love of neighbor. For instance, when the Lord commands Israel to massacre all the inhabitants of the towns of the idolaters in the promised land of Joshua, we should interpret this as a command to root out all the sins in our lives. Now, this view is seconded by the findings of modern archaeologists. They have found almost no weapons in the ruins of the early ancient Hebrew cities in the period after the Exodus. There were few walled towns. Many settled in towns away from the coasts, away from the cities where they were not safe, and settled as farmers and herders in the hills north of Jerusalem, where they scratched out a living as subsistence farmers. Archaeologists had not found layers of burnt destruction in the archaeological layers of many of the cities in the Middle East around the time of the Exodus. The evidence is more mixed. Some scholars postulate that the stories of gradual settlement in the book of Judges describe more accurately the settlement of the Promised Land. And Professor Amy Levine of the Teaching Company, in her lectures on the Conquest, argues that the evidence on widespread destruction is mixed. Although you do see some layers of destruction, these could be from the Exodus, or they could be from normal intra-city conflicts in the ancient world. Likewise, she argues that a close reading of the text in the book of Joshua is mixed. Not all cities were totally obliterated, as a quick reading would lead you to believe. And we encourage you to listen to her Old Testament lectures. They are fascinating, but listen carefully. She packs as much as she can into these lectures. The Torah, the story of the patriarchs in the Exodus, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, were originally stories sung by bards in an oral tradition, perhaps sung for centuries before they were put to writing. The war stories in the book of Joshua fulfill a deep need in a warrior society for a caring God who protects his chosen people, a warrior God who accompanies his people into battle, like the Lord who animated the whirlwind and whose glory is shown in the tent of the tabernacle during the Exodus to the Promised Land. Now, what would it be like to listen to these ancient stories told by our ancestors by the light of an ancient campfire? And by the way, the technical term for that is form criticism. These stories were sung in an uncertain ancient world where you never knew if this would be the year an enemy army would invade and slaughter and enslave all the inhabitants of the land. These stories were to give God's people hope in uncertain times that their mighty God would care for them and protect them from their enemies and their foes, and he would grant his people victory when they faced these formidable foes. And now we'll discuss the sources we used for this video. Reflecting on the Iliad and the Odyssey is essential if you wish to understand Greek history and philosophy, and in my humble opinion, the Old Testament as well. And we also recommend reflecting on the histories by the Greek historians Herodotus, Thucydides, Xenophon, and the Roman historian Plutarch. There are many books that discuss ancient Israel and Judah, and one source we use for this video is Life in Biblical Israel, and also The Social World of Ancient Israel. And these are both excellent sources with many interesting illustrations. Other valuable sources we used extensively are the lectures on the other side of history, daily life in the ancient world, and also the lectures on the Old Testament stories. Both of these are recorded by the Great Courses or Teaching Company, now known as Wondrium. We also discuss the Greek and Roman historians in depth in our book reviews on Greek history and philosophy. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. Please support this channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a very small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus, we will host special discussion groups for our patrons. Plus, you can click on the Meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts. And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.